Walter is going to talk about this in some more detail, but it all begins with the seed seal process on farms, where we ensure that the proper plants are planted in the proper conditions and are harvested correctly at the right time. And all the distillations are performed to rigorous standards, and then the oils are sent to quality assurance. And in quality assurance, we test the oils with a battery of scientific tests because we don't want to depend on just one test. That's just never a good scientific practice. And in fact, we check for things like flavor, odor, color, and then we measure refractive index, and we do optical rotation measurements, and we measure specific gravity, and we check for heavy metals, and we take molecular fingerprint using a Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And make me say that 10 times real fast. We use gas chromatography, and then we follow it up with microbiological testing. And only after an oil passes all of these tests is it released from packaging. And then after the product is packaged, we do all those tests all over again before that product leaves our hands. Now, I mentioned all of those tests just to show you the extensive testing that we do. But I'd like to spend a few minutes explaining gas chromatography, since that seems to be the method that's being discussed a lot lately. And I actually brought something along. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the heart of a gas chromatography system. This is actually the column in a gas chromatograph. And we happen to use some of the longest columns available. This is actually 60 meters long. It's all coiled up. And I don't know if you can see this. It's very fine. It looks like a wire. And it's through this wire that we inject a gas sample, actually an oil sample. This whole thing sits inside of an oven inside the gas chromatograph. And when you inject an oil into here, we heat it up in the oven, and then it becomes a gas. And the gas starts to flow through this tubing. And eventually it exits the other end. And as it flows through that tubing, all the components of the gas start to move at different speeds, and they start to separate. So what comes out at the end is the separated components of the oil. So you start with a complex mixture. What comes out is all the separated ingredients. And then that goes into a detector. Typically, we use a mass spectrometer as our detector to show what's coming out the other end. That's how it's done. The reason I wanted to explain that a little bit is to show you, first of all, that this column is very long. And when we do this method, it takes about 3 hours for us to run a single sample through a system like this until we get to the point where we can actually read the results. If I was back in my old life and I was working on synthetic products, we could easily buy a synthetic standard, probably from FDA or the USP, and shoot it through here and see how it comes out the end of the column. And then we would shoot our sample in, and as long as they overlaid each other, we would know that it was a perfect match and we were good to go. The issue we've got with natural products is that there are no standards because they're not synthetic. No one makes a standard natural product. So it takes a lot of experience and a lot of skill to actually decipher what's coming out of these chromatograms. And you know, our group in R&D at Young Living has over 180 years total experience, and I'm not prepared to admit how much of that is mine. But we've got a lot of experience in interpreting these kind of data. The other thing that's very important to note is that because there are no standards, the way we interpret the data is to look at runs of samples that we have done previously. So what happens over the years, analysts will build up libraries of various materials that they run. And luckily for us, because Young Living is the oldest and the largest essential oil company in the world, we have the most extensive library. So that's a great aid for us to do these interpretations. Now, some of the labs that have a lot less experience have very much smaller libraries or even no libraries. What they tend to do is shoot these things through a system and then depend on a canned computer algorithm to spit out possible matches for the spikes that they get at the end of the system. It's just not that simple. There's a lot of skill that goes into interpreting this stuff. So let me address some of the specifics on cinnamon bark oil testing, if I may. It's important to realize, of course, that science isn't always perfect, and this picture could change as we continue to look into this situation, and we are continuing to look into this situation. But here's what I know right now. We investigated lot 15B0032, which was the lot that was first posted on Facebook. This lot was tested by QA using all the methods that I mentioned before, the color, the taste, the refractive index, the Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. I just like to say that one. And it conformed to all the specifications for natural peppermint bark oil in all of those tests. Additionally, we tested 3 different samples from this lot in triplicate for a total of 9 analyses using GCMS with both full scan and single ion monitoring, which I'm not going to bore you with the details there, but when we perform GCMS analyses, we use very, very meticulous protocols that require us to use solvent blanks before and after each sample analysis to ensure that the instrument is not contaminated and to make sure that it's calibrated properly. We also adhere to very strict protocols for tuning and maintenance of those instruments. To make a long story short, when we ran those 9 tests on those samples, we found none of the markers that were called out in that first Facebook post as indicators of synthetic materials. With the exception of one, actually. There was one marker in there called plinol, which we did identify, but it's fairly well known if one reads scientific literature that plinol is actually found naturally and is not a marker of necessarily synthetics. We sent this same lot to an expert lab in France for GCMS testing, and they confirmed our results, finding none of the markers identified, with the exception of plinol, which occurs naturally. A different lot was then sent by one of our members to an analyst in New Jersey. And that analyst claims to have detected coumarin in our product. And he stated actually that coumarin is a marker for cassia oil. Now, most of you probably know that cassia oil is just a different type of peppermint. It's a peppermint that's native to China. And what we like to use is Ceylon peppermint, which grows in Sri Lanka. Cinnamon, not peppermint. Yeah. Ceylon cinnamon, which grows in Sri Lanka. It also grows in places like Madagascar and Zanzibar. So we actually tested that material for the presence of coumarin, and we found it. But let me tell you a little bit about coumarin. Again, this is where the experience pays off. If one's familiar with the scientific literature, you'll realize that there are numerous reports in numerous peer-reviewed scientific journals that show that coumarin is naturally present in the Cinnamomum verum, or the Ceylon cinnamon. Okay, so it's not necessarily a marker of cassia. In fact, let me read a quote for you. This is from the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry, which is a very well-respected journal in the scientific community. And their conclusion was that out of 22 samples analyzed, 13 showed detectable levels of coumarin. These results are consistent with those of Miller et al., which is in another scientific journal, and Lugarini et al. In another scientific journal, that coumarin levels in Ceylon sticks, in some cases, were found up to several hundred milligrams per kilogram. And it is not possible, this is important, it is not possible to infer that the presence of coumarin can be used to differentiate between cassia and Ceylon cinnamon. Okay? So, frankly, I think that sort of led us a bit of a wild goose chase, but coumarin is just not a marker to be concerned with. Sorry, the journal name is the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry, and it was actually in publication in 2010. It's volume 58, page 10,568. And I'm happy to provide any other references if you'd like them. So now let me discuss one other lot. I don't want to go through all of the lots that have been floating around out there. I'm trying to do some sort of selective examples here, but I want to discuss another lot. That was being number 161212203. And a member sent that to a small lab in Canada for the testing. And that lab claimed that the product was adulterated with synthetic cinnamaldehyde because of the presence of something called phenylpentadienyl isomers. It's really too early to try to pronounce all these things. We tested 3 separate samples from this lot in triplicate with GCMS, using the same rigorous testing parameters I spoke about earlier. And our data do not show the presence of phenylbutadiene isomers. In fact, in addition to the standard full spectrum GCMS scans that are typically run, our scientists also performed something called an ion current extraction procedure. And we were able to do that because they actually identified the specific compounds that we can look for. So it's a way of tuning the instrument in on those specific compounds, and it increases your sensitivity and specificity greatly. So we used that technique, and we still could not see any of the phenylbutadiene isomers listed in the Canadian lab report. Interestingly, we purchased some synthetic cinnamaldehyde standards, which are available from various companies. And these synthetic standards didn't contain any phenylbutadiene isomers either. So I'm really not quite sure what's going on there. I definitely can't, I can't definitively say why these labs arrived at their conclusions because we don't have access to their specific procedures. I can tell you, that these oils can dissolve plastic. So if labs are not using the proper equipment, they could be leaching chemicals from plastic into their samples. We also don't know the purity of their solvents or whether their instruments are clean and properly calibrated. We don't know what other samples are being tested in the labs on the same equipment, so we don't know if there's cross-contamination possibilities. Sometimes to save money, labs change those columns very infrequently because those columns that I showed you earlier for the GC are quite expensive.
I'm calling Dr. Mike.
That's fine. I've been called. Actually, I have a consultant who every time he gives me a call, he says, "Hi, Dr. Mike," so you can call me Dr. Mike. Also, as I said before, there's just an incredibly high level of skill required to analyze these incredibly complex samples. And most of these labs and analysts are quite new to the business. I don't really want to speculate on what they've done. What I can say is that I have very, very high level of confidence in our procedures and the expertise of our analysts. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Walter and let him talk just a little bit more about what we do in short while.
Let me say one thing. Am I off mute?